Thanks for that. Hello. Good afternoon. Get on with it, right? We get straight on. Let's do it. We're not waiting. People at the back sit down. Thanks for being here. It's a pleasure to be partners. I'm from ArtReview, obviously, ArtReview magazine, and it's a pleasure to introduce and moderate this talk and to be here to host this session, which is in partnership with Art Method and Digital Art Mile. My name is JJ Charlesworth. I'm one of the editors at ArtReview. I think that the just get my notes up. I guess I made a few notes to start this off. I realized that ArtReview magazine is very old. We started publishing in 1949, and I guess we've closer to them. Is that better? Oh, okay. ArtReview magazine is quite old. It's published in 1949 originally, and it's been publishing ever since. And one of the things that we've always been preoccupied with is the new and whether the new is good in art. So it's always interesting and good to be involved with discussions of new possibilities in art, particularly as I'm particularly interested in how technology, media evolves and is always poking its head into the visual arts field and changing it and causing all kinds of discussions, debates, problems, and new things, often things which are very good. But they need discussing, criticizing, considering from all angles. Art, it's striking to think that, when we talk about digital art, it used to be a niche thing and old. It used to be something on the fringes of the visual art world for many years, and it took a long time for it to be assimilated into what we do as art, as a field of contemporary art. It could be argued that most artists now are, in one way or another, digital artists, given the way in which technology, media has been welcomed, embraced, used, misused, abused by artists over the last decades. AI is the latest one. Generative art is perhaps a slightly different thing, but we're going to be talking about AI and its consequences, perhaps, with a bit more focus. AI is the latest of this constant encounter between a field of visual art and technology. But it obviously poses some novel and curious questions, things which we have touched on, or the sessions this morning have touched on at various points, to do with whether this is a prosthetic, whether it is a tool, whether AI can be used, or whether AI has its own agency, its own, or AI systems have their own agency or emergent potential to be in some ways autonomous to what human beings do and maybe what human artists do. And so that question needs, I think, some further discussion, especially in a situation when we're not in a bubble. The art world is not just dealing with AI on its own in some kind of purified or cloistered fashion. It is dealing with a technology which has ramped up in a way which is, I think, quite extraordinary and in many ways quite alarming. I think we need to kind of admit that. Gemini is always poking its nose into my business when I'm emailing and working on spreadsheets or whatever it is. And so I think in this session, this conversation with our two speakers, I'd really like to kind of hear their thoughts, quite open and speculative, about what this tool is, or whether it is a tool at all, or whether, by contrast, we maybe are in various ways being used by it. And by it, we need to ask ourselves what that is, that thing, whether it's just technology or some larger complex of forces, economic, political, cultural. So I'm just going to introduce our two speakers here, who you will be, I hope, very familiar with. To my direct left is Simon Denny. He's an artist. He represented New Zealand at the 56th Venice Biennial and has exhibited widely, including at MoMA, Serpentine and Bundeskunsthalle. His work explores blockchain, gaming and state surveillance through installations, objects and systems, and he teaches at HFBK in Hamburg. And to his left is Hito Steyerl, whose brief biography is quite simply that she's a filmmaker and a writer based in Berlin. But I'll add to that that Hito's just published a very good book of essays, I guess, yes, called Medium Hot, which in many ways really does respond very intricately and with a great deal of openness to the complexities and difficulties of the arrival of AI, both in society and in visual art and in visual culture. So if you want to put your hands together to welcome them. And whoop if you feel so inclined. So I guess we have discussed this in a preamble online, and sometimes those kinds of discussions are good to start with, and then suddenly you realize, well, maybe we should be slightly shifting what we're talking about. Hito, in our Zoom conversation in preparation to this, said, please don't ask the question of whether AI can make art, which I think is fair enough. So I won't. But what I want to get started with is ask you to kind of consider is rather whether it makes art, how it's intervening in art making, and whether that is good. Because I think that's more the question that we want to kind of dig into, is this issue of who's in control and what its uses are. I was mentioning to Simon that it's 60 years now, 61 years since Marshall McLuhan published Understanding Media, which is subtitled The Extensions of Man. So the idea for me of where we are in terms of our own prosthetics, our own tools, our own machineries, I think is really important now, because a very kind of pessimistic take on AI and certainly its corporate manifestation seems to take us away from extensions of what we are to something which are extensions of something quite different. So I don't know who wants to jump in.
Well, thanks, JJ. Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Georg and team. Pleasure to be in dialogue, Hito. I mean, I don't know. I think for me, when new technical systems scale to consumers and within ways of organizing different organizations and our lives, essentially, I think often artists and people as artists, have a limited agency in choosing what one can engage with and what one can ignore. So I think for me, the thing that I think about the most, maybe to your prompt, is how, as these systems scale, which actors will be advantaged, in what ways, by the way that they kind of reorder the possible for all of us, right? And that's true, I think, as an artist, like what you can do with what, how. But it's also true in terms of like politics and all the power things that we engage with when we enter the social world. So I think that's the level I think of, like what's being reordered. I guess it's quite McLuhan-esque, if you want to frame it from that perspective. Suddenly things that are possible today were not possible yesterday, and suddenly actors that have certain skills become more powerful under emergent rules and ecosystems.
Emergency rules also, yeah, or emergency rule even. Yes, I mean, thanks for having me. Thanks for putting up with me. I think I'm going to have to say all the awkward things right now, immediately, just in order not to tiptoe around the issues. Because for me, as a basically documentary filmmaker by profession, it's really important to also consider basically the context of new technologies, the infrastructures, the industries, etc. And also, I mean, I think it's almost impossible to ignore the effects that Gen AI is having on, us, the world, society, etc. at large. And I'm afraid it cannot really be separated from art making, right? I mean, one can try to ignore it to a certain point, but at one's own peril. And if we look at how Gen AI has been evolving at an extremely rapid pace over the last, only few years, then I think we are now at a very urgent point where Gen AI has become, as many writers have articulated, a sort of trademark aesthetics of right-wing governments, of tech authoritarians. That's one point. The other point is also to consider the total enshittification of the digital sphere and internet through, vast amounts of slop, disinformation, propaganda, and so on and so on. There is, of course, the massive emerging impact on the environment through basically fast implementing an energy infrastructure to satisfy the energy required, the presumed energy requirements of AI industries, which is, of course, going to have and already having a large toll on the environment. There is, of course, also the massive, and I think that's especially going to be very clear to creatives, the emerging impact on creative professions, among others, programmers, designers, bankers, financial advisors, bookkeepers, you name it. I think all these jobs are going to be in for massive restructuring during the next decade or so, or even less, 5 years, give or take. And I think all of these are consequences that cannot be really meaningfully separated from using these tools in an artistic way, which I think is definitely possible and even to some degree important, but one cannot pretend that the social consequences are not there already big time. I mentioned, for example, just look at militarization of AI, which has been accelerating big time with the crisis or the conflicts, the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, for example. So I think all of these need to be taken into account when considering also the use of these tools in the art world. There, I said it. It's done.
No, but maybe I can
Okay.
just jump in and
Do you want to bring?
agree
I
and
think these-
confirm there. I mean, I think this is what I was sort of trying to imply with the opening statement. So it's great to have that more explicitly stated. I think the actors that I had in mind that are very good at using these systems are the people who are also adjacent to building the systems often, and people that are used to dealing with emergent environments. So, some of the political actors that I think are rising to, having more power are indeed very literate in these systems and get fantastic information on what works, and I think this is the same with also its adjacency and the foregrounding of the military aspect of it. So I think, I think it's indeed very important to put a point on that and address it also in this context.
Okay. Can we take some of these apart discreetly? Because I think that, and look at whether there are spaces. Because I think, Hito, your kind of position is very all-encompassing. It assembles all the major problems, and I think it's good to point these out and acknowledge that there are all these dimensions to the arrival of, when we say AI, we are talking about deployments of different scale and of different purpose by completely different actors. So that, and with regards to art, we have seen obviously an explosion of excitement, as you know, and fascination, which perhaps was quite complicit in enabling and developing some of the core aspects of the technology and its uses. But nevertheless, we have, in terms of compartmentalizing the discussion a little bit, there is visual culture, which has been profoundly affected by these technologies in the last 5 years, say. And I think it's absolutely right to talk about that. That's not quite the same then as, and creative employment and creative industry or creative labor is, as you rightly point out, going to be significantly affected by it. Then so I worry about creatives, in that kind of 2000s sort of, or 1990s idea of the creative as opposed to the artist. And then there is the art and the art world and the artist. So I just wonder if we might talk in a bit more kind of detail about some of those localities, whether they have, we've talked a lot about autonomy this morning and throughout the day. The term keeps popping up. I think it's really important. I think it's important to try out the different definitions and meanings of the term. So to throw in a kind of classically modernist version of autonomy, is there space for autonomous art practice, or an artist whose capacity to act is still within some spaces of freedom of action or possibility of action that's not completely overwhelmed or subsumed by what we're witnessing? Because I think it's important to acknowledge that, given some of the discussions this morning about making creative and original use of certain technologies for a certain goal, let's say, whether it is drawing and vision, artificial vision and human vision, whether it is to do with how to use these technologies towards picturing and visualizing issues around ecology and environment, and so on and so on. So big data into something which is more comprehensible. So I think I just want to kind of like ask you both to kind of dwell on that particular issue and then like maybe work back out into some of these bigger questions, because sometimes it can get very depressing, and you are artists, so you must get up in the morning and think it's still worth doing. If you see what I mean.
I mean, just to be clear, I don't find this especially depressing compared to anything else.
Right.
Just to be very clear about this, the world is always a complicated
Relatively
place.
speaking.
No, I mean, and the question of autonomy, I think, is also relative in that sense, because, of course, we're all embedded in incentive groups and systems, and I think what is not, I think maybe we're talking about differences, but we should also talk about continuities, because I think something that artists also always work within is various different communities which have various different relationships to funding and support, and value creation is obviously a social thing in all of our artistic worlds, so you cannot produce completely autonomously because otherwise it's just a hobby on your own at home. So I think these systems are changing, and the systems of power are changing, and the scale is changing, and maybe the actors who are advantaged are changing, but I think the problems of acting as an artist, I find continuous.
Yeah, I mean, with autonomy, there's always been this dialectics between trying to act on one's own and never being able to do that. I mean, that's also a recurrent issue in discussing autonomous art. I mean, yeah, the spectrum runs from autonomous art in analogy to autonomous weapon systems, so-called fire, find, and forget function. I think certain artworks are also trying to emulate that, or, trying to exist within this kind of framework. But on the other hand, I think definitely there is a huge question there, right? Because whenever I try to really work, let's say, with diffusion models or something like that, I realize that I'm not really able to fully deploy them as a tool. I can never be autonomous because they have always been pre-formatted, pre-trained, pre-structured. The architecture is already a given, right? So I think one important point would be, if there was to be any autonomy, then to think about how to create an autonomous stack, about even being able, to use those tools in a way that would, allow me to really do exactly the things I want to do and not what something else has already been deciding for me, or the training process or whatever. That's one possible perspective, autonomous stack. A second perspective is so, as I said, my thinking is influenced by cinema, thinking about images, image theory. There's been a lot of talk, for example, by people like Trevor Paglen, about operative or operational images that are programmable, that do something in the world. And I started thinking, well, I think most art today is also very operational, right? It is already programmed to do specific sets of things. It is instrumentalized from the get-go in being, applicable and having to be efficient and having to do something and having to check the boxes and, bring eyeballs and whatnot. So I think one other perspective to approach this would be to think about what could a non-operational art be, to start to de-operationalize art and to think about, and this is actually a very old discussion, what could be an art, especially in this context, which doesn't do anything, which refuses to do anything, which just is, whatever it is, but, which doesn't conform to the pressure of being efficient, quantifiable, profitable, and so on and so on. So that would be another way to approach the question of autonomy.
I feel like I'm interrogating you both. But, Simon, are you in agreement with those possible projects?
Yeah, I think they're definitely things that are very useful to think about. I also would add to those, which actor would want those, right? Which actor would want the autonomous art, and which actor would prefer an operationalized framework, right? I, certainly with my own practice, prefer to get involved in things rather than removed from things. And I know that I'm glad that there's artists that strive to be outside of existing systems and challenge them from a relative place of autonomy. But I also think a place of compromise and embeddedness is also an interesting mode to operate in. So I would maybe add one more mode to that, of those artists who want to be completely embedded in these systems and kind of enter them as curious agents, not uncritical agents, but also try to find out the dimensions of the space as it emerges, rather than in opposition to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I gave two possible perspectives.
Exactly, and this is a third,
that's
perhaps.
the only ones, right? Far from it. And I'm also far from making this complicity argument. It's totally uninteresting to me. It's not about guilt or being complicit or anything. I'm thinking, how can one engage with these systems, because they are important, because they are formatting our lives, whether we want it or not. Right. But in a way which takes this complexity into account, instead of, ignoring it or trying to push it away. I'm working with those systems, right?
Could you say a bit more then on that, on the trouble or the difficulty there that you encounter? Because it leads back to my simple kind of simplistic question, naive question, what we want to achieve from the situation that we're in as artists or within the art world. So you've alluded to working with these systems. Now, maybe from the practice, from a perspective of revealing your kind of studio practice, as it were, what were you seeking to try and achieve or to work out? Or is it pure experimentation with no goal, or is it to to investigate certain problems which you see you might be able to offer a perspective on or a solution to? I don't know, because you mentioned working with these things and then also that they don't do what you want.
Yeah, I mean, that's the default. That's technology in a nutshell.
Okay.
Maybe many people's experience of technology also, right? I think.
But it's not your experience as a filmmaker, because your filmmaking is very
That also.
accomplished, no?
Things do not work, that's default. Yeah. No, but I mean, very concretely, in working with these systems, I've noticed a loss of autonomy, in being able to really interfere, train my own models, etc., etc. This has become more difficult. The threshold, the amount of resources you need to really do that has risen quite dramatically. And I resent that. I mean, I would like to have, properly trained foundational models where I can really influence the parameters instead of being dependent on, models. I have no idea what the training data contain. I mean, it's been discussed a lot in terms of stable diffusion, etc., but only because we know, at least partly, what kind of training data has gone into that model. We have no idea what kind of things are basically forming the base of other models, right? So in that sense, it's like working with a tool, but you're forced to use it with gloves or even, boxing gloves or something like that. Yeah.
These presume that we're talking about a culture of images as well. And I am interested in the way, in what I've seen in this morning's presentations, because there's a slightly different attitude to the image. That's to say, it's, it might be an image that's made by a hand, but the hand is a robot. That the visualization is not understood in terms of that kind of, the classical idiom of the mimetic image. Because I think, when reading your book, there's many points which I agree with, that something is disintegrating in terms of our kind of visual culture. You mentioned certain videos and certain AI experiments which are trying to reach again back to kind of pure mimetic, like realism, like pure verisimilitude, as they used to call it. And I don't know if that's I think that's where it wants to go, and I wonder whether we want to go there with it. I mean, I think maybe that kind of pressure of the model is the pressure of a technology that assumes that what everybody wants is, real, unreal images. I mean, I don't know if that's...
Maybe as a counterpart to that, like I recently listened to a conversation between Carly Buster, Little Internet, and Mark Leckey, where they talked about the return of iconic images. And I think that's very noticeable. And I think one of the amazing kind of things that I've witnessed in this community, or whatever, the NFT adjacent art world, if I can make a little localized version of the art world, is this emergence of the importance of kind of like being connected by networked icons, and that becoming an expression of community and values, and it sort of articulates and feels out a subcultural kind of expression, and it also can be the domain of a political project at the same time. So I think this is a very interesting way which images, I think, have shifted, especially adjacent to this community, where a project like Remilia and Milady can be a mimetic icon that is defining a community and then forming the base of an emergent political project. And I think that is something that is really not about how, I mean, it's a little bit about how things look and about how images are formed, but it's also about a different kind of networked composability of an icon.
Which is, of course, a cult value, right?
Exactly.
It's not indexical or symbolical.
Exactly.
Yeah, the power of creating community by relating to it in a sort of presumably unmediated way. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking this too this morning. Maybe paradoxically, many of the Gen AI art practices are closer to painting, and let's say 19th or even earlier forms of art making than to 20th century forms like cinema and photography. I have the feeling, I mean, if we talk about Gen AI's images, I'm not really sure how or if they are images, which is totally neutral. I'm just undecided. I don't know, right? What I know is that they do not relate to reality or the outside world in the same way that a photographic paradigm used to, relate to the world. So we're basically at the moment, I was discussing this yesterday with Constant, and he said, we're back in the 19th century. This is lithography, right? We basically jumped this moment of the indexical image where the machine would guarantee a sort of relation to reality. And this was just a blink in time. And from the prehistory to the 19th century, there's always been, this other relationship to images, and maybe we're just going back there. The 20th century is over. There is no more basically universal idea of standards of reality. That's just not happening anymore. We're going back to illustration, basically, right? And I think that's a very interesting point. I mean, very neutral. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it seems to happen.
Exactly, and it's also, this again relates to, I think, our opening statements with, who wants what out of these image making practices, right? Like, if we're not looking for something indexical, but we're rather looking for something iconic, or, what does that mean about us as actors, us as a group, us as communities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from the public. I mean, this may sound sarcastic. It's really not, right? But from the public sphere to a sort of cult value sphere again, right?
I mean, I think that's a super interesting and major question, because I think this is where it becomes, I mean, I certainly would put value judgments on that, because I'm particularly curious about and apprehensive about regression, not in the AI, the technical sense. Is it diffusion? What's the word? Regression is used in diffusion models, right? Anyway, but there's
so is adversarial, right?
Yes, yeah. But regression is cultural and maybe even like civilizational. I'm not sure. I think it's a very interesting point to recognize that kind of value that we moderns, as it were, or us 20th century modern people, attached to the lens-based image, is now essentially just being, eroded, subverted, mocked. I mean, I find that there's a level. I think when we talk about AI imagery and the way it's come from, say, those early GAN images, maybe like in 2017 when those were being published, and then through Google Deep Dream, and everybody going, isn't it funny? Look at all the dogs, popping up in the Van Gogh painting or whatever it was, or these kind of strange eyes. And so, but then we get to a point where we're actually seeing loads of images that we recognize, but they induce in me a certain kind of nausea, right? A kind of sick feeling of the loss of the index, right? And it's only getting worse the more it gets better at doing what it's doing, right? And I very much recognize this idea of the return to the icon, because I think it's also something very disturbing about the fact that we no longer care about a community or a culture that at least shares certain kind of values about the image being authoritative, right? So just a weird one. It really bothered me. I don't want to get into Gaza and Israel, but or Greta Thunberg particularly. But Greta Thunberg refused to watch videos. It's very interesting. When she was kind of escorted back to her flight, while she was being detained by the Israeli authorities, she refused to watch the proof, the evidence, right? And I think it's a strange world that we're now in, where people are much more interested in reaffirming the image that they want inside their head than accepting that reality might be out there. I mean, throwing that in as a provocation, but
I don't know. I wonder if maybe the types of things you're describing, and the hesitations and the pushing back, are also things that, to my knowledge people have also wanted to push back on, right? Like it's, and not only from one side of the political spectrum, also from both, right? We're, you know, we've antagonized some right-wing formulations, but also the left has been, you know, antagonizing the modern for a long time, and the notion of the authoritative image also can be, you know, dominating in a negative way, instrumentalized to define a reality that also doesn't always have a relationship to everybody's experience of what the world is and what the world should describe. You know, I guess, being a person that grew up in New Zealand from a settler culture, I was just always very aware of kind of dominant culture versus kind of, you know, other ways of formulating the world. And so I wonder if this emergence of these new affordances, of the time that we're moving into, of the technical space that we're all moving into also, and if this is coming back to the question of the beginning of this talk of what can artists do, I think there's a lot of work for artists to do to kind of navigate this new emergent technical environment where these kind of types of images get reordered in terms of importance and value, and to be actors in that space, to find a way to be actors in that space and build a world which we do think is, one we want to see. And I don't know.
Yeah, I have maybe a little addition to make, because I think it's not really about, you know, Gen AI being pre-modern or ritualistic or cult-like and, let's say, 20th century photography, cinema not. I don't think that really is the case. I had this conversation with Günzeli Yalcinkaya, and she asked me, is there a re-enchantment happening with Gen AI right now? I said, no, it's not a re-enchantment, it's a re-enchantment. Because it's sort of the enshittified version of magic, right? It's a sort of quasi-magic, which is basically added as a sort of PR value. These systems are not really magical. They are statistical. They're very basically bureaucratic, dusty, you know, a lot of tables in their files, folders, etc. It's more like Kafka's world as, you know, Lord of the Rings or something like that, right? So I think one should be quite cautious, you know, when trying to imbue these systems with magical faculties.
Yeah, and also the performance of transgression is not also the same thing as magic. And I see a lot of people taking a lot of joy and libidinal, whatever, like energy out of transgressing and using these things to transgress politically and also in terms of images and norms and things like that. But I agree that I think the ability to try and describe it in terms of a re-enchantment. I think one can map a political agenda behind that, you know, which is not particularly magical. It's rather more operational, you know.
I mean, I take those points that it's not actual magic, right? It's not, but I think that's the kind of, it's a metaphor, the idea of re-enchantment, because I think you see that term used quite a lot in various disciplines and sort of cultural spaces now, the idea of the re-enchantment of the world as an idea that there's a move away from, you know, those kinds of strictly rationalistic Enlightenment legacy modes of epistemology and ontology which, you know, refute any and reject any mystery, right? Now, I'm a little bit concerned about those kind of reactions, because I see them as reactions in both on the left and the right, actually, in various ways. But just to kind of play with that a little bit, it's when you say it's re-enchantment, yeah, I think it's correct. It suddenly reminds me of, and I'm sorry to get all theory and old theory, but you know, there's a great essay by Adorno called Theses on the Occult. And in fact, it's really there that those kinds of questions kind of reapply. We now maybe are in a situation where you can be served up whatever your imagination projects as the image of the world, right? And that actually there's now perhaps something much more kind of strange going on, which is that's a feedback loop now. Your response to images produces images that respond to you. and it's not even, and whether it's an operational, it has an operational layer to it, I think is a big issue. It's a political issue.
I think there's an opportunity to operationalize it that some people take. That's maybe what I more meant.
Yeah, no, okay. I mean, I hope, are we following this? I'm not sure I am, but I think this is where it gets to be the interesting, and perhaps the question of agency and autonomy is how do we recognize that an image culture is being made responsively to our own prejudices, subconscious biases, predilections, bias affirmations. That we have a world in which we are increasingly set in being offered the idea that our view of the world can be reaffirmed, and that where we go to actually, and the danger is that we always go to the media, we always go to the networks that give us the reaffirmation, and principally through images, principally through the manipulation of which images get prioritized. So I think those are significant problems and questions, and I'd be very, not necessarily here, but going forwards, I think that's a real big issue for artists, because we are surrounded, the art world is now surrounded by people who are antagonistic to certain norms, to certain common assumptions about how to behave socially, politically, culturally, that maybe we haven't experienced for some time. A war situation, an emergency situation. Anyway, this is.
Is this a call to defend the radical center?
Well, okay.
No,
because
but to be fair, the art world is also now surrounded by people who are antagonistic to the arts, right? We could also say that, and maybe this is linked somehow. If you conclude that basically common frameworks of comprehending reality have been shattered, that of course has to do with the shattering of institutions that would safeguard or uphold, certain standards of viewing, evaluating reality, etc. I mean, I can see this in the art world also. I mean, I don't know. I mean, actually, it's my first time at Art Basel. I have nothing to say about it, but I'm sure, I'm sure if I went there, I could probably also see, the fragmentation of the art world that's been happening during the last few years, the shattering of a more or less commonly constituted, unevenly commonly constituted canon of contemporary art into several bubbles, that each constitute their own technical standards, but also canons, but also financial paradigms, geopolitical, fiefdoms also. So basically we see that not only happening in relation to standards of reality, but in the way our reality is being reformatted into a multipolar system overall, right?
Simon?
I've been to Basel 15 times. I think I really like Art Basel Art World. But I agree. I mean, I don't know. But again, I guess I would reframe it again from my own experience of growing up in a different part of the world and experiencing first a more localized art world or an art world that wasn't fully integrated into this art world. First becoming a part of that art world, then actually via Art Basel becoming part of a center actually, or a perceived center, and then moving to, I guess I'm able to see both sides, right? I hear the call for coherence, for a common platform of being able to address a common reality, but I also hear the advantages of being able to find an infrastructure for a more pluralistic description of what is going on. So I'm hesitant to say I want to defend this, maybe modern post-war, I don't know, transatlantic center, because I know that it didn't serve every place that I've been to.
Oh no, definitely not. out.
Right.
That's for sure. Yeah.
So I think we should be careful when we, again, that I'm also not saying that those notions of being able to perform a reality and relate to something, and we're talking about the same thing, doesn't have value either, right? So, but I think it's both valuable to me and the many me's that that come together to be able to talk about both.
There are 2 points, questions I want to bring up before I bring this great audience into the conversation too, because I think we should have some Q&As, right? Definitely have some Q&A. One thing that Hito mentioned when we were chatting beforehand, and then to come to Simon's idea of different publics and different communities. But I just wanted to kind of go back to something you mentioned when we were having a coffee before, which is that you noticed, and this is not about not doing a crit, as it were, a critical session on the works and the artists that have been presented, who were presenting earlier, because that would be unfair, given our vantage point at the end of the day. But you talked about the hand and the drawing and painting. And just to kind of go back to noticing that in some of the artists who were presenting this today, there's this huge kind of revalorization of looking, touch, the hand and the drawing and the gesture. Now, I think those are interesting too, and I'm a great lover of drawing, all the way back. I think as an art student and as an artist, and then as a failed artist, drawing has always been my first go-to, my first love of something to do with oneself, one's eye, one's hand, and the world outside. Now, I don't know if that's a regression. I don't think it is. But I think it's really interesting to note that in all this swill, all this slop, that is primarily 2D pixel arrays, that artists are kind of going back to, returning to certain kind of modes of encounter, which seem to be archaic, right, in a way. I don't know if you're...
Yeah, or it's a way to try to handle really as in the sense of hand, these enormous systems which seem overwhelming, by breaking them down into components, into vectors, into movement, into things that can be comprehended somehow, right? Aesthetically or intellectually, or maybe more aesthetically than intellectually, right? And I think I see this also in Simon's recent work, in trying to go back, break down these vast systems into, let's say, an X and a Y axis, and then see what happens, right? Just to make things not manageable, but to break them down to a point where a single brain or human can confront them in a way at eye level, let's put it like that, or hand level, if you like. Also, I want to say I agree with what you said before. It's really important for me to make this clear. Yeah.
I mean, this brings us back to a longer discussion that I think Hito, full disclosure, Hito put on a really compelling conference at her art school a couple of weeks ago in Munich that my students were also able to attend, and there was a really sophisticated discussion there of like vector space and the kind of complexifying of vector space. And I think one thing that indeed I've been making recently also mechanical paintings, partly responding to things that I've seen in this community, actually. I'm always very interested in where the community around again, I don't know how to label these sub-worlds or whatever, but digitally interested and literate artists go with their attentions and their energies. And I think there has been a kind of reinvestment in the plotter and the history of plotter art, and a kind of a move out of circulating images that I think the NFT art world was really very online, only online, even kind of claims to being better to be only online. To come back to kind of move between different types of worlds. And I think this was really exciting for me because I came to this conversation at a moment when the social media world was being integrated into the wider let's include the Art Basel art world in that, you know, and what was often referred to as the post-internet art world, you know, where artists that I was adjacent to were going to art fairs, trying to sell objects, but also being very aware of how they circulated in the increasingly powerful social media world, and kind of trying to navigate both of those spaces. And I see this kind of like move backwards into a history of mark making that, you know, computational art in the 1960s kind of had to deal with, because plotter art was sort of the only way to get something out of the machine onto the page. And it's interesting to come back to use those more simplified tools to exactly antagonize and integrate with and dialogue with this much more complex vector space that is, you know, the way that generative AI images get formed, right?
Yeah, but I also think it's important to engage with vector space and, you know, its many complexities, because it will exit the latent and manifest, right? And this is a sort of move of making it manifest, because it is manifest. It will come basically for all of us one way or another. So making it manifest, you know, dragging it out of the black box, so to speak, or semi-black box, I think that's super important.
And pushing back on this notion that the physical and the computational spaces are separate. You know, I think this is one of the other things that I think is really cool to see, you know, mark making enter into this dialogue again more explicitly, because I think it naturalizes this idea that like screen space or the internet is not outside of us. We're already in these very hybrid worlds, and making these kind of online-offline definitions are not a very useful rubric for understanding contemporary experience, right? You know, I'm here, but I'm also chatting to my mother in New Zealand, and I'm also thinking about something that happened in a different space, and we have this very augmented experience, which I think is good to then address that both with artworks.
Mark making is also a military term, isn't it? I mean, I'm not really sure about the English, but I think a mark is a target, no?
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, so there you have it, mark making. Right?
Adversarial mark making.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
How are we doing? Yes, we could go even further into that. I just wanted to, but I'm sure the audience will have their own perspectives on that, because I think it's a super interesting and important move. That thing of, I was always horrified when I had just got the hang of IRL as the kind of thing that you say to people, right? In real life. Yeah. And I thought it's quite funny, because I'm an old person. I mean, I feel quite old. Or I'm very conscious of developments around me that I recoil from. And then and once I got the hang of IRL, I was then sort of shocked to discover that people much younger than me use AFK, away from keyboard.
Which is also kind of antiquated now, right?
Which is now
Who uses
antiquated.
keyboard?
Well, exactly. But I think that you know, the fact that we are grappling with needing to kind of reintroduce our bodies. You see it, for example, in Random International's works, which are essentially about dance, you know, working with machines to see whether dance and gesture, the dance gesture can be a thing, can be worth doing in the same way as we were considering whether the machine's, you know, hand is a thing worth pursuing. But I think those things kind of reflect on our kind of fractious and anxious kind of relationship to disembodiment that's going on. You know, this is a very strange period in Britain, for example. Everything is broken, right, except the digital screen network platform capitalists, right? The trains don't quite run on time. The road surfaces are falling apart. You know. Jobs in the public sector are kind of disappearing or not functional. People, you know, everything that's physical and tangible and social doesn't really work. And at the same time, you've got kind of, you know, Amazon drone delivery, or, you know, Amazon lockers, or everything is happening through these screen platforms. So I think it is absolutely, you know, key to recognize that. I don't know if it's romantic or if it's doomed to failure, but we are having to kind of work back into physicalizing. I mean, I think even in your kind of work where you've used base materials, very kind of poor materials to make a primitive screen, replying back to the seamlessness of the image, to replying back to the kind of forgetting of the material, I think is super important. Just to kind of quickly come back to this, Simon's kind of issues around, or questions around communities. You talk a lot about communities. I noticed that you notice communities as if you're not part of them.
As if I am, or
as if you're very aware that they exist. I think and I think in terms of talking about whether there's a kind of space that one can operate in, a bubble, a community. I think that is perhaps, and then wondering about how the art world may be breaking down into little factions, community, bubbles, spaces that previously were kind of able to relate to each other but no longer are, or something like that, the way Hito was describing. And then thinking about, the NFT community and economy. Okay, so that didn't quite work out.
It worked for some people.
It worked for some people.
Continues to.
And yes, for some. So is that something that, in a way, are we seeing the end of the kind of old integrated notion of an art world and an artist? And should we be very sensitive to and very alert to new communities?
I mean,
like the one you were perhaps describing about the.
I think I come to this with the biases of my upbringing again, because my entry point into the art world was not from the middle, and so I've always been very aware of communities because I often had to actively try to enter them rather than coming from them, and I think it's also fine and kind of natural and whatever, maybe wrong word, but there are moments of activity, bursts of activity. I think the art histories I know are also full of this, where energy enters into a particular community, exciting, productive things are done in that community, and then they disperse, and that comes together around technologies. It sometimes comes together around place. It sometimes comes together around, particular opportunities that emerge in particular configurations and localities. And I think it's just how things are, right? And I notice these because I also try to move between them actively. I don't only passively drift between these communities, but I also try to enter and often try to bridge these communities, which is actually quite hard. I found over the, that they have local values, let's say, that form, and they're dynamic values. They morph, they change, they come into and out of adjacencies with each other. But I've struggled for many years trying to take, let's say, the value of the community of people that make up this conference and this art fair with the values and communities of the one that make up the one down the road, and try to share the enthusiasm I have for both. And sometimes they fall on deaf ears in by both directions, right? So it's I don't think this is again one of the things I would say is more a continuity than a difference.
I mean, the modernist art world was based on the dominance of the US. And then there was a globalization art world, which ended probably in 2016 or something, from maybe 98 or something like that. And now we're in a period of transition where there is many competing forces, working on the art world, fragmenting it partially, and we don't know yet, what's going to be emerging. I just have to say, and I want to come back to this, but it would be a shame, if large parts of the technological art world were swallowed up by these large conglomerates pushing fascist futurist statistics, right? That would be a shame.
Great. Huge amounts to reply to. So we got about, 10 minutes? 10? Yeah. So this is for you to make brief points, interjections. I'm just going to go up the room as I see the hands coming. Gentleman here with the blue shirt.
Do you want me to have a microphone?
Oh, that's
good idea.
That's a very good point. Sorry.
Sorry to be a little instructional.
It's the right thing to do.
Hi, Mark Spiegler. Simon and I had a conversation a couple of years ago, which Simon may not remember, in which we were talking about how technology makes collaboration between artists simpler, easier, more thriving, and in a way goes against the notion of authorship, that sort of artworks are owned by multiple people, created by multiple people. And yet, as I was thinking about this, and as you were talking, I was thinking that actually AI allows people to work more individually. It used to be that if you were going to make a film, you needed a scriptwriter and a director and a principal actors and character actors and extras and stunt people and editors. And at least the last three categories, AI does really well. In fact, you don't need someone to play the young Tom Hanks because AI can age and rejuvenate him at will. And so my question is there a degree to which AI allows, or often perhaps even forces or seduces, authors to artists to work, or let's say creatives to work less collaboratively?
I can respond to that. You know, I think it's just obscuring the fundamentally collaborative nature of AI, which is based upon, you know, troves of stolen data by basically anyone in the world. So anything that anyone does with AI is already co-produced by tens of thousands of collaborators. And what AI does is to basically obscure and cut these links of provenance, right? And privatize the result. And I think one should really go back, right, to the fundamentally collaborative nature of AI and enable all the collaborators to basically participate in the result one way or another.
I guess my point is that, yes, in theory, you're collaborating with everyone who's ever written something.
Exactly.
But that's not the same thing as collaborating with individuals and bringing them in as equal partners within the process of creating work.
And maybe that's an opportunity to retool the experience to be more, including both of those models for me. So I would answer your question with the short answer also on an immediate level where I think you were also addressing it. Like, no, actually, I don't think it isolates, because also even at this local level, even outside of the inherently collaborative parameters of the technology, which I agree with Hito on, it completely underpin the whole thing, and even are kind of a model for how ideas always circulate in the air, and we kind of take from them an authorship over any ideas anyway. Kind of like, I mean, I think actually AI as a collective thing is a great model for understanding that, you know, original ideas come from somewhere. So rather, I would say there's an opportunity for the people building these systems, and there's also artists trying to do this more explicitly. Somebody that came along to Hito's talk was, of course, Matt Dryhurst and Holly Herndon, and they're trying to make their own much more attributable worlds where these things can be acknowledged. So I think, yeah, the opportunity would be to make these things more explicit, to make the collaboration more explicit in the technology. You know, blockchains are so great at provenance. We can scale that up, you know, and make sure the provenance is visible everywhere.
There was something in one of the previous talks which I really liked, which was talking about the minimum viable engineering that goes into something, and I think usually blockchain is over-engineering something, which is actually quite simple. You know?
The person here in the white shirt.
Hi, thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. I have a question regarding authorship in AI, and especially the terminology that I'm facing a lot recently, which is like people describing themselves as prompt artists. The act of writing, of course, is authorship, but in this infrastructure, I think it becomes very problematic. What do you think?
I mean, I don't know if I can start this. Like, I think there's kind of two answers always to these questions. It's a little bit annoying to be so pedantic. But on the one hand, there's the obscuring thing that I think is always relevant to these contexts that Hito has mentioned. So the prompt, in its simplicity, obscures a lot of things that's going on. So in that sense, I agree. It's a complicated thing to claim, and maybe also vibing with what Mark was, I think, also reaching for. In a way, maybe there's a similarity there too with this question. I mean, there is a skill set that one needs to develop if one enters into this, and there simply are prompts that do better things than other things, even in dialogue with like very cooked systems that have black boxes that you don't understand underneath it. And many artists I know, you know, John Rathman would be one that comes immediately to mind, do something very productive just with like fucking around with prompts in pre-cooked systems. And I think he brings something out of those worlds by getting to be a very good prompt engineer. Something he shows us something of what's happening in those systems, you know. So I wouldn't say it's a problematic thing in the operational way. I think it does this obscuring that has already been articulated, but I think prompt engineering is real. You know, it is a role.
I'm going to go, because I know this lady here, and then there's a person, human.
Maybe just before that, Hito can add.
Oh, sorry.
No, very shortly.
Yes.
I think the prompting issue throws a very interesting light on the relation to language, because, this is for me one of the examples where humans are being trained to machines to talk in a way the machine can understand or act accordingly upon. So this is a real training process, right? Training humans to act according to the needs of the machine.
And as it's language models in itself, right? It's also leveraging our own technology being reimagined, right? Because the first technology that's needed for large language models is language itself, right? And English language often.
Brief questions then. The lady here with the microphone.
Hi, Alexandra Art. Hito, you mentioned that there is a fragmentation and sort of different art world canons emerging, and then later on you also mentioned that it would be a shame for conglomerates to sort of take over the technological art world we're developing. I wanted to just a few thoughts on what do you think is missing and what direction do you see it taking?
What's missing is more basically infrastructural public engagement. Why are these models, or the ability to create these models, to really engineer these models, why is it taken away from us as artists, for example? I think, there would be probably a lot of other things that are missing, but I think engagement with infrastructure, trying to imagine what I call an autonomous stack, and to identify its components, and step by step trying to bring them into the world with many failures, mostly failures actually. I think that would be really important.
We have 3 minutes, so I'm going to try and get 2 more questions in. But if you can, sorry, there's a gent at the back, and then there's one here. And if you can direct it to one of the 2 speakers, maybe, so that we can get punchy, short responses from them, so we can get everybody in.
Okay, I'll try. Marston from my practice here. Thank you for the awesome talk. So I'm curious a bit about the timing of our field's current focus on AI's societal consequences, because at the beginning, when generative AI was kind of new, we were much more enthusiastic, and now when it's accessible, it almost seems like in discussions like these, sometimes we cannot go beyond the doomerism of our time. And sometimes I wonder if that is a comfortable position for us, to be in the opposite of what's going on in the wider society. So I'm wondering, are we being kind of selectively ethical here? And that would be to Hito.
Selectively ethical, how? What do you mean?
I just mean that we tend to focus on the AI ethics and not on all the other ethical issues in our field, like exploitative label practices in art, or dubious funding sources for projects. That's our current focus.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Yes, I'm not in the AI ethics crowd either, I have to say, and I have addressed many of these things, and this is part and parcel of the situation. But I think, I think unfortunately it's a fact that specifically Gen AI aesthetics have been taken over big time right now by specific governments, authoritarians, etc. There is, to not acknowledge it would be foolish at this point. This has nothing to do with doomerism. I also think that in focusing too much on generative output visual, one tends to miss all the developments, and I think that's almost intended because Gen AI is, thrown out as a kind of distraction from all the developments that are happening in analytical AI at the same time. The creation of big databases by Palantir, enabling deportation, etc., etc. So by keeping people focused on slop, I think they tend to lose sight of all the other things happening in the field also. And that's also a sort of selective view on AI as a whole.
I'm going to squeeze in one last one for this lady who's been waiting patiently, but super quick.
Sure.
Brief.
I'll try to be quick. So I guess this is somewhat to Hito. Hi, Shakti Shrima. I think we've seen over maybe the last millennium, right, the word and the image come apart, in the time of the Reformation, as we went from illiteralism and back to literacy, and then, Luther and all that. And now we're seeing the word and the image come back together in a new confluence and correspondence with sort of prompt engineering. And we've talked a lot today about what that means for our aesthetic culture in terms of spam and slop. But what do you think it spells for our linguistic culture?
Simon, yeah. Throw it over to Simon so he gets a go.
I definitely don't know. So it's. Yeah. I mean.
No, we could talk about conjuration, again, going back to this magical idea. What does it mean for linguistic culture? I cannot give you a quick
I think that's
answer.
yet to be seen, right? I don't know. It's maybe emergent.
Yeah.
It's a good question,
Yeah,
in other
under
words.
construction. Yeah.
Okay, well, we have to finish on time. So I just want to thank you all for your very good questions, and thank ArtMeta and the Digital Art Mile team for partnering with ArtReview. Thanks for coming, and thank you very much to excellent speakers this afternoon. Thanks.